My wife smiled every single time someone asked how we met. Not a polite smile, a real one, the kind that reached her eyes before she even answered. It happened so often I could predict it. Dinner parties, family reunions, work events, even complete strangers. Someone would ask, "So, how did you two meet?" Emma would immediately squeeze my hand, smile like she'd just remembered her favorite memory, and say, "He rescued me." People always laughed. From a flat tire? From a bad date? From a burning building? Emma would simply shrug. Something like that. Then she'd kiss my cheek, and somehow change the subject before anyone asked another question. Everyone thought it was adorable. So did I, for 10 years, because I'd always assumed it was one of those inside jokes married couples invent. The truth? I remembered meeting Emma in a tiny bookstore downtown. I was 30, she was 28. We both reached for the same mystery novel. Our hands bumped. She laughed first. I apologized. We ended up talking for almost an hour. Then we got coffee. A year later, I proposed. It wasn't exactly a movie-worthy love story, but it was ours, or at least, I thought it was, until one rainy Saturday. Emma was visiting her sister. I stayed home to clean the attic. Mostly old boxes, Christmas decorations, college notebooks, nothing interesting. Then I found a dusty cardboard box marked, "Newspapers. Keep." Curious, I opened it. The top newspaper was dated 11 years ago, about 3 months before Emma and I supposedly met. I almost tossed it aside. Then I noticed the front page photograph. My heart stopped. Emma. There was no doubt. She looked younger, a little thinner, but it was her, standing outside a courthouse, wrapped in a blanket, surrounded by police officers. The headline read, "Local teacher survives 6-day kidnapping." I felt every muscle in my body go cold. Kidnapping? I stared at the article. Read it once, then again. Emma had been abducted while leaving work, held for nearly a week, found alive in an abandoned warehouse. Police never publicly identified the person who reported her location. The anonymous caller disappeared before officers arrived. Authorities described him only as a civilian who wishes to remain unidentified. I couldn't breathe. Why had Emma never told me this? 10 years of marriage, thousands of conversations, countless late nights, and she'd never once mentioned she'd survived something like this. Then I noticed something else. Someone had folded the newspaper so precisely that only one paragraph remained visible. It had been underlined in blue ink. The anonymous caller refused all public recognition and requested permanent confidentiality. I frowned. Why underline that? Why keep this newspaper for over a decade? The front door opened downstairs. Emma was home. I quickly carried the newspaper into the kitchen. She smiled the moment she saw me. "Hey." Then she noticed what I was holding. The smile disappeared instantly. Not faded. Disappeared. Like someone had switched off a light. She whispered only one sentence. "Where did you find that?" "The attic." Silence. I looked at her. "You were kidnapped?" She slowly nodded. "Why didn't you ever tell me?" She closed her eyes. For a long moment, she didn't answer. Finally she whispered, "Because if I told you everything, I'd have to tell you how we really met." The room suddenly felt much smaller. I frowned. "What do you mean? How we really met?" Emma didn't move. She stood in the kitchen doorway, staring at the newspaper in my hands. I'd never seen her look afraid before. Not once in 10 years. She slowly walked over, folded the paper exactly the way it had been folded before, as if she'd done it hundreds of times, then placed it back on the table. "I always wondered when you'd find that." I frowned. "You knew I eventually would?" She nodded. The attic wasn't a very good hiding place. Neither of us smiled. Finally I asked, "Why didn't you tell me?" She looked away. "Because I wanted you to know me. Before you knew what happened to me." I didn't understand. "You've had 10 years. I know. So why now?" She took a deep breath. "Because if I tell you, you'll start looking for him." The words hit me strangely. "Him." She nodded once. "The man who saved me." Every muscle in my body tightened. There was someone else, someone she'd never told me about, someone important enough to keep secret for over a decade. I tried to sound calm. "Who was he?" She didn't answer. Instead, she quietly said, "He never wanted anyone to know." That's not an answer. I know. "Emma." She looked directly into my eyes. "I promised him." Those 4 words echoed in my head. I promised him. Those 4 words echoed in my head. I promised him. Not the police. Not the court. Him. Something inside me twisted. Did you know him before? No. After? Silence. Emma? No. But I spent months trying to find him. I stared at her. You looked for him. Every day. Why? Tears filled her eyes. Because I never got to say thank you. That should have made me feel better. Instead, it made me feel worse. Because there was something she wasn't saying. I could feel it. She wasn't lying, but she definitely wasn't telling me everything. That night I barely slept. Emma lay beside me, peacefully asleep, or pretending to be. Every time I closed my eyes, I pictured the newspaper headline, 6-day kidnapping. Then I heard her words again. I promised him. Who makes a promise like that? To a complete stranger. The next morning, Emma left early for work. As soon as she drove away, I opened my laptop. I searched every newspaper archive I could find. The kidnapping had been national news for nearly a week. Every article repeated the same thing. No one knew who had called the police. No fingerprints, no witnesses, no name, just anonymous caller. Then I found something different, an old interview with the lead detective. Near the bottom, one sentence caught my attention. Without that phone call, we would have been at least 30 minutes too late. 30 minutes! I leaned back in my chair. Whoever made that call hadn't just helped, he'd saved Emma's life. That afternoon, I drove to see Emma's mother. I didn't tell Emma. I just showed up with coffee. Linda hugged me warmly. What a surprise. We talked for nearly an hour. About work, about vacations, about nothing important. Finally, I asked, "Can I ask you something?" She smiled. Of course. I found an old newspaper. Her smile disappeared instantly, exactly like Emma's had. You know. She quietly nodded. I do. Why didn't anyone ever tell me? Linda sighed. Because Emma asked us not to. Why? She wanted that part of her life to stay behind her. I hesitated, then asked the question that had been haunting me. The man who rescued her. Linda looked confused. What about him? Did Emma ever find him? Linda's expression changed, just for a second, a tiny hesitation, almost impossible to notice. Almost. Then she answered, I don't think so. But she'd looked down when she said it. She'd broken eye contact. She was lying. Not a big lie, just enough. Enough to make me certain. Emma knew far more about the mysterious stranger than anyone was willing to admit. As I stood to leave, Linda suddenly grabbed my wrist. Daniel. I turned around. She looked genuinely worried. If Emma decides to tell you the truth, please let her finish before you judge her. I frowned. Judge her? Linda slowly nodded, because what she did afterward, most people would never understand. I drove home with my heart pounding. I wasn't thinking about the kidnapping anymore. I wasn't even thinking about the anonymous caller. I could think of only one thing. What exactly had my wife done after she survived? I couldn't stop thinking about what Emma's mother had said, what she did afterward. Most people would never understand. Afterward, not during the kidnapping, not before it. After, whatever Emma had done, everyone in her family seemed to know. Except me. For the next week, I watched my wife differently. Not because I didn't trust her, because I realized there was an entire chapter of her life I'd never read. One evening we were watching television. A missing person report appeared during the local news. Emma immediately muted the TV. She didn't look away. She watched every second, every photograph, every detail. When the segment ended, she quietly unmuted the television and continued watching our movie. Like nothing had happened. I asked, "Does that kind of story still bother you?" She hesitated. Yes. Then, after a pause, I always wonder if someone is still looking. That answer stayed with me. Someone, looking. A few days later, I returned to the attic. There had to be more. The newspaper couldn't be the only thing she'd kept. I searched every box. Old tax papers, photo albums, Christmas lights. Nothing, until I noticed something strange. One cardboard box had a false bottom. It lifted out easily. Hidden underneath was a small white envelope. My name wasn't on it. Emma's wasn't either. The front simply read, Evidence. My heartbeat quickened. Inside were only 3 items: a faded bus ticket, a cheap motel key card, and a receipt from a gas station. All dated, the same week Emma had disappeared. None of it made any sense. Then I turned over the motel key sleeve. Someone had written one sentence. In Emma's handwriting. He waited here until the police arrived. He, again, always him, never a name. I decided I'd had enough guessing. The next morning, I drove to the police station listed in the newspaper. I honestly didn't expect anyone to remember an 11-year-old case, but the receptionist surprised me. The detective who handled that case retired. She smiled politely. But he volunteers on Thursdays. Today's Thursday. 20 minutes later, a gray-haired man walked into the lobby. He introduced himself. Tom Harris. I shook his hand. My name's Daniel. The victim, Emma Collins. His expression softened immediately. I remember Emma. I married her. He smiled. I'm glad. Then his smile slowly faded. You finally found out. I blinked. You knew she never told me. He nodded. She asked everyone involved to respect that. I swallowed. I need answers. He was silent for a long moment. Finally, he motioned toward a bench. I can't discuss confidential evidence. I understand, but I can tell you one thing. I leaned forward. The anonymous caller was the bravest civilian I've ever dealt with. So who was he? I can't tell you. Even now. He shook his head. I gave my word. Another promise. Another person protecting this stranger. My frustration boiled over. Why? Detective Harris looked me straight in the eye. Because keeping his identity secret saved more than one life. I frowned. I don't understand. You will. He stood, then reached into his jacket pocket. He handed me a small business card. On the back, he had written an address. No explanation, just an address. I looked up. What is this? The place where Emma first asked me the same questions you're asking now. What happened there? He smiled sadly. She found something that changed the way she looked at the man who saved her. That afternoon, I drove 2 hours to the address. It wasn't a police station or an office. It was an abandoned delivery warehouse on the edge of town. The same warehouse mentioned in every newspaper article. Most of it had been demolished. Only one brick wall still stood. People had covered it with graffiti over the years. I was about to leave when I noticed something hidden behind an overgrown bush. A small metal plaque. It looked homemade, barely visible. Someone had engraved just one sentence into it. Thank you for stopping. Nothing else. No names, no dates, no explanation, just 4 words. As I stared at the plaque, a voice behind me quietly said, I wondered how long it would take. Before you came here. I turned around. Emma was standing only a few feet away. She looked exhausted. Not angry, not frightened, just tired. She glanced at the plaque, then back at me, and softly said, That isn't where you think our story began. It's where I first fell in love with you. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The wind pushed loose leaves across the cracked concrete. Emma walked past me. She knelt beside the small metal plaque, ran her fingers across the words. Thank you for stopping. She smiled. The same smile she'd worn every time someone asked how we met. Only now, it wasn't happy. It was grateful. You came here, I finally said. After everything happened? She nodded. Every year, for 10 years. I looked around. There isn't even anything here anymore. I know. So why come back? She looked toward the empty warehouse. Because this is where my second life started. I took a slow breath. Emma, who was he? She closed her eyes. I can't tell you. Why? Because I promised. I laughed quietly. Not because anything was funny. Because I was exhausted. Everyone promised. You, your mom, the detective, apparently half the city. She looked at me. No, only 3 people. And they all kept it. I stepped closer. Did you love him? The question escaped before I could stop it. Emma looked genuinely shocked. What? The man who saved you? Silence. I need to know. She stared at me for several seconds. Then, she reached into her purse, pulled out a folded photograph, and handed it to me. It was old, slightly faded. A police officer stood beside Emma. She looked exhausted, wrapped in a gray blanket. Behind them, someone had been circled with blue pen. Only his back was visible. He was walking away, wearing a dark jacket, hands in his pockets, head lowered, leaving before anyone could stop him. That's him? Emma nodded. The only picture anyone ever took. I turned it over. Written on the back, in Emma's handwriting, were 5 words. The man I never thanked. I looked up. You kept his picture. I kept the only proof he existed. Something inside me hurt. I didn't know why. Maybe jealousy. Maybe guilt for feeling jealous. I couldn't explain it. I quietly asked, if you walked through that gate right now, what would you say? Emma didn't answer immediately. Instead, she looked toward the empty road, as though she'd imagined that moment 1,000 times. Finally, she whispered, I'd say, you gave me my future. Then she smiled. And I'd finally tell him thank you. I nodded, trying to ignore the strange heaviness in my chest. As we walked back toward the car, I noticed something. Emma wasn't wearing her wedding ring. She always wore it. Always. Emma. She looked down, realized it too. My ring. It's gone. We both searched the ground, the gravel, the weeds, every crack in the pavement. Nothing. After 20 minutes, she sighed. I must have lost it. She sounded oddly calm. I'm sorry, I said. She looked at me and smiled. It's just a ring. No, it isn't. She gently took my hand. It never was. On the drive home, neither of us spoke. Halfway there, Emma suddenly asked, Daniel, if you found the man who saved me, what would you do? I answered without thinking. I'd thank him. She smiled softly. I knew you would. Then she turned toward the window, watching the passing trees, almost whispering to herself, I always knew you would. That evening, after Emma fell asleep, I couldn't stop thinking about the photograph. The man's posture, his height, the dark delivery jacket, something about it felt familiar, not recognizable, just oddly familiar. I convinced myself I was imagining things until the next morning. I was making coffee when my phone buzzed. It was Detective Harris's office the moment he called. He was waiting outside. No small talk, no handshake. He simply handed me an old flash drive. I've kept this for 11 years. I frowned. What is it? The security footage. My pulse quickened. The warehouse? He nodded. It's damaged. There's no sound. And the picture isn't perfect. But I think you're finally ready to see it. He plugged the drive into an old computer. The timestamp appeared. 3 days before Emma was rescued. A grainy black and white image filled the screen. A loading dock. Rain. One security camera overlooking the parking lot. Nothing happened for almost 30 seconds. Then, a delivery van pulled into the frame. It stopped near the entrance. A man climbed out, wearing a dark courier jacket. He carried 2 cardboard boxes. I leaned closer. Is that him? Detective Harris nodded. We believe so. The man walked toward the warehouse, then suddenly stopped. He looked around, as if he'd heard something. The video had no audio, but I could almost imagine it. A scream. The man slowly set the boxes on the ground. He walked toward a broken side window, looked inside, and froze. Even through the blurry footage, I could tell he'd seen something horrifying. He immediately pulled a phone from his pocket, dialed, spoke for less than 10 seconds. Then, he didn't leave. Instead, he stayed, watching the warehouse, keeping his distance, never taking his eyes off the building. I looked at Detective Harris. Why didn't he leave? He was making sure the kidnapper didn't move her before we arrived, so he risked being seen. Yes. Why? The detective quietly answered. Because if she'd been moved, we would have lost her. Minutes later, police cars flooded the screen. Officers surrounded the warehouse. The courier stepped backward, keeping himself hidden behind his van. The footage showed him watching until Emma was brought outside alive. Then, he quietly picked up his boxes, got back into his van, and drove away, without speaking to anyone, without waiting, without accepting thanks. I stared at the frozen frame. He really just left. Detective Harris nodded. He refused every interview, every award, every request to testify publicly. He disappeared. I kept staring at the screen. Something bothered me. The van, the logo on the side. It was blurry, almost unreadable. I leaned closer. The detective enlarged the image. The quality became worse. But one word was still visible. Hawkins Delivery. I frowned. I know that company. So did we. We interviewed every employee. We couldn't identify the driver. Why not? The company had gone bankrupt 2 weeks later. Most records were destroyed. As we left the office, I couldn't stop thinking about the van. Hawkins Delivery. Why did that name sound so familiar? That evening, I opened an old storage cabinet in the garage. I wasn't even looking for anything specific, just hoping something would trigger my memory. Inside were dozens of old folders, tax documents, insurance papers, employment contracts. Then, one thin envelope slipped onto the floor. Across the front, in faded black marker, were 3 words: first job. I smiled. I'd almost forgotten. Inside were papers from years before I met Emma. Pay stubs, training forms, a faded employee ID. I picked it up, and my entire body went numb. Across the top, in bold blue letters, it read, Hawkins Delivery Services. My hands started shaking. No, that couldn't be possible. I turned the card over. The employment dates, 11 years ago, exactly the same month. Emma had been kidnapped. I whispered, no. Then I noticed something else. The employee photograph. I was wearing the exact same dark courier jacket, the one from the security footage. At that exact moment, Emma walked into the garage. She saw the ID in my hand, closed her eyes, and quietly whispered, I was hoping You'd find that yourself. Emma looked at the old employee ID in my hand. Neither of us spoke. Finally, she walked over, took the card from my fingers, smiled sadly. I knew this day would come. I could barely get the words out. That was me, wasn't it? She nodded. Yes. The courier, the anonymous caller, the man outside the warehouse. I stared at her, but I never knew. I know. I sat down on the garage floor. My legs simply gave out. I don't understand. I would have remembered something like that. Emma knelt beside me. You didn't know it was me. What? When you looked through that broken window, you didn't know who I was. You just heard someone begging for help. She gently squeezed my hand. You stopped. Most people would have driven away. I closed my eyes, trying to imagine it. Rain, a delivery route, a random warehouse, one decision, one phone call, 1 minute. That changed 2 lives forever. I wasn't brave, I whispered. I was terrified. Emma smiled. I know. The detective told me. He said your hands were shaking so badly. You dropped your phone twice trying to call 911. I laughed through my tears. That sounds about right. She stood, walked into the house. A minute later she returned carrying a small wooden box. I had never seen it before. She placed it between us. Open it. Inside were dozens of photographs, not of us together, of me. The first one showed me climbing into the Hawkins delivery van. Another showed me carrying packages outside an apartment building. Another, standing in line for coffee. I looked at Emma in disbelief. You took these? She nodded. After I left the hospital, my heart started pounding again. You found me? Yes. How? She smiled. I knew the company name from the security footage. So I waited outside the depot, every morning, for almost 3 weeks, until she finally saw me. I wanted to say thank you. So why didn't you? She looked down at the photographs. Because every time I walked toward you, you looked happy. You were laughing with coworkers, talking on the phone, living your normal life. And I couldn't bring myself to walk over and hand you the worst week of mine. So what happened? She smiled. The bookstore. I blinked. The bookstore? That part wasn't a lie. I really did reach for the same book, but not by accident. She laughed quietly. I'd memorized your lunch break. I knew which bookstore you stopped at every Thursday. So I stood there, pretending to browse. And when you reached for that mystery novel, I reached for it too. I couldn't help smiling. So, you staged our first meeting. I staged our second. She corrected me. Our first meeting happened outside that warehouse. You just didn't know my name. I picked up one of the photographs. It showed me completely unaware, walking out of my delivery van. You watched me for weeks. I did. Were you ever going to tell me? I tried. 3 different times. What stopped you? You. I frowned. What did I do? The first time, you told me you'd always wanted to meet someone by pure chance. The second time, you said fate was more romantic than coincidence. She smiled through tears. And the third time, you asked me on our first official date. I realized something. What? If I told you then, you'd spend the rest of your life wondering whether I loved you, or whether I simply felt grateful. I reached for her hand. So why tell me now? She looked at me with the same smile that had started all of this. Because after 10 years of marriage, I finally know the answer. What answer? She intertwined her fingers with mine. I was grateful to the man who stopped, but I fell in love with the man who stayed. A few months later, we hosted another dinner party, right in the middle of dessert. One of our friends laughed and asked, So, how did you two meet? I looked at Emma. She looked at me. For the first time in 10 years, she didn't answer. Instead, she nodded toward me. I smiled. We met twice. Everyone laughed, thinking I was joking. I squeezed Emma's hand. The first time, I saved her life. The second time, she gave me one. Emma's eyes filled with tears, then she smiled. The same beautiful smile she'd worn every time someone asked that question. Only this time, I finally knew exactly why.